In this chapter, we're going to talk about the range of policy goals that local governments are trying to achieve when they use zoning and other forms of land use regulation. If we remember from the preamble from the New York City's 1916 zoning ordinance, it was primarily about the direct impacts of buildings on surrounding neighbors, the height of buildings, the uses, so thinking about these spillovers to the surrounding community. But over the course of the 20th century, local governments have added the range of goals they're trying to accomplish, and zoning is one of the tools that gets heavily used for a variety of different outcomes. One of these, in fact, is fiscal zoning, the way that local governments use zoning to affect the flow of revenues coming into the community and the demands on public services that they have to pay for. One of the key themes we want to keep in mind is, because zoning impacts the kinds of homes that can be built in a community, it also impacts the type of people who can afford to live in that community and to buy in. So if we go back to the original intent of mitigating the spillover impacts of buildings on neighbors, it's helpful to look visually at the kinds of impacts that we're talking about. So here's another shot of a typical street in New York or in a large city where you see a lot of very tall buildings that are close to one another. If you've ever walked through Midtown Manhattan or the Loop in Chicago in January, you know that not much sunlight reaches the streets. The buildings are so tall they effectively block a lot of light getting down to the lower levels. So you can imagine both pedestrians who are walking on the sidewalks and people who live or work in the lower floors of buildings are going to be impacted by the amount of light that gets through due to the surrounding tall buildings. We can also see in many of the pre-zoning cities that you have a really interesting combination of kind of older buildings that have been squeezed in between newer developments that go up. So here we see an example of a tiny little building that's squeezed in between this very small space between larger buildings. That's the kind of impact that zoning was originally intended to think about. What does it feel like to live or work in one of these buildings that doesn't fit and is overshadowed by its larger neighbors? New York City has developed a nice visual code to go along with their zoning that explains how this works and the way that you would think about buildings and designing buildings to think about the impacts on neighborhoods. So this shows us the example of the sky exposure plane, which is essentially thinking about the angle that light is coming down from the sun and how that might get cut off to lower level buildings and to the street level. And so you can see here, taller buildings that are sort of full and boxy are likely to cut off more of the light. But if you do something like a step back on the top of the building, that allows more natural light to go through there. So we actually have figured out a number of architectural techniques to build tall buildings, but mitigate this impact of sunlight reaching the ground floor. Besides this sort of height and bulk of buildings, original zoning was very concerned about the spillovers from incompatible uses. And again, if we think back to early 20th century cities, we know that there was a lot of manufacturing that happened in cities because they were close often to water and easy ports of entry. So we had big factories that were noisy, that were smelly, that used dangerous chemicals, things like meatpacking plants. So lots of activities that most people wouldn't want to live near, and you wouldn't even necessarily think about having kind of a financial district or a business district or even kind of shopping and commerce right adjacent to manufacturing. So we worry about these incompatible uses next to one another, and zoning tries to keep them away from one another. But it's worth going back and thinking about how much does this really impact cities and neighborhoods today, and are we identifying incompatible uses that actually aren't that incompatible? This is a map showing the Union Market neighborhood of Washington, D.C. This is one of the fastest growing neighborhoods in the city. Historically, Union Market has been a wholesale market where farmers and other sort of providers of produce, meat, fish have brought in trucks full of things, unload it in sort of large batches, and then it goes out through a distribution system. So this is actually one of the few industrial parts of Washington, D.C. It's right adjacent to New York Avenue or Route 50, which is one of the major highways coming into the city. It's one of the few areas that still has large industrial buildings that can facilitate trucks coming in and loading and unloading as a distribution point. So up until about 10 years ago, that was the primary purpose of Union Market. You can see that we still have some remnants of this, areas where trucks pull up a couple times a week, unload. And truck traffic is one of the things that most people don't want to live nearby. These wholesale markets often are pretty noisy. There's a lot of activity, including overnight hours and early morning hours. and it can be pretty smelly on the day that the raw fish gets delivered. But over the past 5 or 6 years, the Union Market neighborhood in DC has been absolutely transformed. It has been changed from primarily a wholesale market into a mixed-use residential and commercial area with a lot of public space, tons of restaurants and bars and shops. It's become one of the trendiest neighborhoods in the city. This has happened alongside the continuation of the wholesale market, but gradually buildings have been bought by developers. They have replaced these spaces for trucks to pull up with high-rise apartment buildings, shops, restaurants, and a lot of sidewalk seating. So what we think of as these incompatible uses, trucks bringing in produce and trucking them out again, that this can't possibly take place in a residential neighborhood. It turns out people are fighting over the apartments and condos in this neighborhood, even though there's still wholesale activity going on. And it's worth thinking about, too, the difference between the kinds of manufacturing or industrial activity that take place in cities today versus 100 or 150 years ago. More of the manufacturing has moved outside of cities to the exurbs where they can be close to airports and highways. More of what we would think of as manufacturing that happens in center cities tends to be things like food production that doesn't necessarily occupy a lot of space or create the same sort of externalities. One of the newer reasons that local governments rely heavily on zoning has very little to do with physical spillovers of buildings and land uses, and a lot more to do with the fiscal health of the community. Local governments rely heavily on property taxes to pay for a lot of the goods and services they provide. So local governments are the primary financiers and providers of K-12 education. They pay for things like emergency services, police and fire, roads, sidewalks, and some amount of public transportation, open space. These are all things that local governments have to pay for. When communities grow, more people move in or more people work in a community, there's an increased demand for these public services. So local governments have an incentive to think about, with each new development, how many people will move in, what kinds of services will they demand, and how am I going to pay for this? Property taxes, they're assessed both on homes and on commercial properties, are the largest single source of revenue for most local governments. So you can see on average, half of revenues for local governments comes from these property taxes. There are a variety of other things, including impact fees assessed against new development, user fees, and sales taxes, but property taxes are still really the workhorse of local governments. Well, how is that related to zoning? This shows you an example of a couple of homes in the town of Milford, Connecticut, which is a fairly economically diverse suburb of Connecticut located between Bridgeport and New Haven. So this shows you two different houses at very different price points. One of these is a condo building, small, modest, older condo building, and you can see that there's a one-bedroom, one-bath condo that's for sale for about $200,000. That brings in about $2,500 a year in property taxes. So that's the amount of money that the owner of that condo has to pay to the city of Milford every year. The other property is a $1.5 million very large single-family house. This is a 3,000 square foot house with 4 bedrooms and 3.5 baths. Because it is a more expensive house, they pay a lot more in property taxes. Here, about $16,000 a year. So you can imagine that the City Council of Milford is trying to decide, do we approve a subdivision of $1.5 million homes that pay in $16,000 a year in taxes, or do we approve a bunch of one-bedroom condos that will sell for $200,000 and bring in less? It's sort of an apples-to-apples comparison, but not really, because we want to think about what the demand for public services is by people who live in these properties. So local governments tend to go to the property that pays me more is better for my finances. We should allow more of those. But think about who lives in a 4-bedroom house and who lives in a 1-bedroom condo. Families with kids are much more likely to live in larger properties, which means that increases the demand for schools. Schools are the most expensive item for most local governments' budget. 1-bedroom condo could conceivably have a family with kids, but is more likely to be a single-person household or possibly a couple. And so in fact, local governments do this calculation. They tend to favor more expensive homes and single-family homes over multifamily, but it's not actually clear that they're doing the right calculations and assessing the direct impact on public services. Because this belief is so deeply held, though, local governments tend to use fiscal zoning to favor large homes on large lots with higher price tags, which obviously is going to have implications on who is able to live in a community. So it's important to talk about the role of zoning in maintaining or reinforcing economic and racial segregation, but also be clear that zoning didn't invent economic and racial segregation in the US. We know that over the history of the country, there are many, many policies that have disadvantaged particularly Black households, Latino households, and Native households that have made it more difficult for them to afford high opportunity communities. Zoning is one of those layers, but it's not the only one. If we can think back to one of the sort of original drivers of racial segregation, this is an example of a redlining map that was prevalent in the 1930s. The federal government exercises controls over mortgages that are given to households in order to buy homes. And the federal government developed this process of creating maps for communities, designating green and blue areas as areas that could be invested in, that were a good place for banks to lend money, for people to buy homes. And then the red areas, redlined, were places that they discouraged banks from making mortgage loans because they believed the values of those properties would not last. Not at all coincidentally, the redlined areas tended to be primarily occupied by Black or Latino households, depending on the city. Starting in the 1930s, we had a series of legal and formal restrictions on mortgage lending in Black neighborhoods, not merely to Black households, but also to white households who might have bought into those neighborhoods, effectively limiting the flow of capital and investment into primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods. These redlined neighborhoods have persisted over time in various forms of disadvantage. So a groundbreaking study was done a number of years ago that showed that previously redlined neighborhoods are more likely to be subject to urban heat island impacts. These are neighborhoods that today have less tree canopy, fewer parks, less open space and grassy areas, which means that in the summer they become much, much hotter, and their residents are more likely to have health problems related to extreme heat. So we can see, this is for the city of Richmond, the redlined neighborhoods in the 1930s are still today the neighborhoods that have the worst environmental problems with extreme heat. I say this as an example of the types of policies and the ways in which these policies layer on top of one another. Zoning reinforces racial and economic segregation by enforcing uniformity of houses. When the only home that you can build in a community is a large detached home on a large lot set back from its neighbors, and that home sells for $1.5 million, effectively you are saying people who can't afford a $1.5 million house are excluded from this community. Because there's such a persistent correlation between income, wealth, and race in the US, that effectively means that Black and Latino households and Native households have a much harder time buying homes in a community where all of the homes sell for $1.5 million. Even though there's nothing written into zoning codes today that discriminates against Black and Latino households, the impact on the price of housing mitigates who has access to a community and has very clear racially disparate impacts. This is not all about zoning. If we want to improve integration in our cities, we have to think about things like access to capital, access to public resources, things like the tree canopy in parks that have impacts on neighborhood well-being and amenities and on housing prices. But zoning is a key part of why we have such persistent racial and economic segregation in American communities today.